The city wakes before the sun. Dust hangs in the air like a rumor not yet spoken. Checkpoint soldiers lean against their rifles, eyes scanning roads that used to feel familiar. Shops open slowly, as if unsure the day is safe enough to begin. In the neighborhoods, whispers move faster than traffic. Something is shifting in Ouagadougou, something quiet, something heavy. A convoy passes, no sirens, no announcements, only engines humming through a capital that pretends nothing is happening. Yet everyone feels it, the pressure building beneath the routine, the sense that the ground itself is preparing to break. The storm of 2022 did not gather in the sky, it gathered in the silence of a nation that had lost too much land, too many lives, too much direction. A day that began like any other would not end like any other, and from that day forward, Burkina Faso would not walk the same path again. Stay with this story. This is the moment a country stepped into a storm it could neither predict nor avoid. Before 2022 broke open, Burkina Faso had already been living inside a shrinking map. Villages disappeared from state control not because they vanished, but because the roads leading to them no longer belonged to the nation. Checkpoints once symbolic became frontlines. Highways once busy turned into corridors of fear. A journey that once took 2 hours now required escorts, convoys, or prayer. The ground changed first, quietly, slowly, inevitably. In the north, whole departments were cut off. Djibo, once a vital hub, survived on helicopter drops, the relief between hope and siege. Kompenga and Tapoa felt the pressure of forces no newspaper fully mapped. The country was not falling, it was thinning, stretching, losing shape, and in that fragile shape, a new tension formed, one that no speech could calm and no negotiation could delay. Soldiers spoke softly of exhaustion. Patrols ran with fewer vehicles, fewer supplies, fewer guarantees of return. The radio brought reports of ambushes that felt closer each week. Families at barracks waited longer for messages that used to arrive quickly. It was not a collapse. It was a slow unraveling. By late 2021, Burkina Faso faced something rarely spoken aloud. Its own vastness. Too many kilometers to defend. Too many roads to keep open. Too many districts where the state existed only on paper. The capital felt it last. Always last. As capitals often do. But even in Ouagadougou, the signs gathered. Long queues at petrol stations every time a rumor spread. Schools opening late after nights of distant gunfire. Families whispering about relatives in the north whose villages no longer answered the phone. The weather was innocent, the sky was clear, but the country felt like a field waiting for the first crack of thunder. And then it came. Not from clouds, but from discontent layered over years. Rank upon rank, the frustration in the armed forces deepened. Not at the enemy, but at the feeling of fighting blind, fighting under-resourced, fighting without enough voice in decisions that shaped their survival. Inside barracks, conversations sharpened. Officers argued over strategies. Younger soldiers questioned orders older generations had accepted. The air felt thick, as if something invisible were turning slowly in the nation's bloodstream. Outside the barracks, the country breathed with the same uncertainty. Markets grew quieter. Nighttime movement thinned. Truck drivers refused routes they had used their whole lives. Some towns paid triple for basic food because no convoy dared to cross the open roads. People no longer feared the unknown. They feared the known, the familiar, the predictable pattern of territory slipping away. By January 2022, tension became a second climate, present everywhere, discussed nowhere. The warning signs did not shout, they accumulated. A command post overrun, a supply line cut, a district capital isolated. A battalion posting a message that traveled faster than any official statement. And through all of this, the sense of weight grew heavier, the feeling that the country was standing still while the land beneath it continued to move. Burkina Faso did not wake on the morning of its political rupture because of a sudden event. It woke because years of pressure finally aligned. The roads knew it first. The soldiers felt it next. The capital realized it last, and by the time the city understood, the momentum could no longer be stopped. What rose in 2022 was not a surprise. It was the culmination of every unspoken warning the land had been whispering. Because storms rarely arrive from above. Sometimes they rise from the ground itself, and the first tremor had already begun. And the question lingered. The moment arrived without a siren. No broadcast, no declaration, only the uneasy silence of a capital that understood too much without being told anything at all. Before dawn, the first convoys moved, armored vehicles rolling through narrow streets with headlights dimmed, as if the machines themselves were trying not to wake the city. Residents watched from windows left half open, not out of curiosity, out of recognition. They had seen this choreography before, not often, but enough to remember its meaning. Shops opened later that morning, but only halfway. Metal shutters stayed half down, as if the owners were unsure whether the day belonged to business or to history. In the heart of Ouagadougou, traffic thinned until the city felt hollow. Bars stayed closed. Motorbikes idled in clusters at intersections, each rider waiting for someone else to explain the day. But no explanation came, only rumors. Faster than the convoys, sharper than the gunfire that never arrived. Something is happening. Someone has moved. Somewhere, a decision has been taken. It was not fear, it was expectation. Across the city, people sensed that the tension of the last years had finally found a doorway and was now stepping through. Inside military camps, the atmosphere thickened. Orders shifted hands quietly. Younger officers moved with a certainty older generations had not shown. Phones went silent. Gate guards stiffened. The air felt like metal. Some units committed immediately. Others hesitated. Not out of ideology, but out of exhaustion. A feeling that any path chosen would cost more than the country could afford. At the presidential sector, the silence deepened. Roads were blocked, movement restricted. The capital watched, not knowing what was happening inside, but understanding that whatever happened there would redraw the lines everywhere else. In neighborhoods across the city, families stayed indoors. Children asked questions the adults could not answer. A strange calm settled. The kind that arrives when everyone realizes shouting would change nothing. Yet beyond the city limits, the reactions were different. In the north, people wondered if this shift would finally restore protection to towns abandoned to fear. In the east, families prayed that new leadership might reopen routes that had been closed for months. In the west, merchants hoped convoys might return to the roads again. Hope, fear, and exhaustion moved together like three shadows trying to merge into one. By afternoon, the picture sharpened, troops aligned, a new command took shape, and by evening the transition stood unmistakably in motion. Some celebrated, some remained cautious, some simply waited, because waiting had become a national discipline. But the streets felt different, as if the capital itself understood that the page had turned, whether anyone wanted it to or not. Reports circulated quietly of power blocks shifting, units pledging new loyalties, and negotiations unfolding behind gates that would not reopen for hours. Yet one truth cut through the noise. Even as power changed hands, the frontline outside the capital did not pause. Villages did not suddenly regain safety. Roads did not clear. Armed groups did not retreat simply because a statement would be issued the next day. The storm inside Ouagadougou was not the same storm raging across the rest of the country. Night fell, the city exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition. History had moved, but the danger had not. A government had shifted, but the battlefield remained. And across the nation, people asked a question that no leader, old or new, could answer immediately. Would any of this change the realities on the ground? And in the silence that followed, the uncertainty thickened. But even as power shifted, the war did not move. The transition in Ouagadougou felt sudden, but beyond the capital's ring roads, change arrived slowly, too slowly for those who needed it most. In the northern provinces, the days did not shift when the government did. Roads remained cut, markets remained empty, villages remained trapped between fear and isolation. For many families, the measure of life was reduced to one question: will the next convoy arrive? And often, the answer was silence. Djibo, once a beating heart of the Sahel, became a symbol of this fragility. A city surrounded, a city supplied only by air, a city watching the sky for helicopters carrying flour, medicine, hope. Each landing felt like a victory. Each delay felt like abandonment. In Dori, schools closed not because teachers left, but because the road into town belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. In Seno and Odolan, families harvested crops they could not transport. Markets existed in theory, but not in practice. Telecom signals flickered, electricity cut without warning, nights stretched longer than any night should. And all of this created a truth too heavy to ignore. When a nation loses land, it also loses time. Mothers counted days in hunger, not in calendars. Fathers measured distance in risk, not in kilometers. Children learned to distinguish gunfire from the sound of trucks on broken roads. These were not statistics, they were the geography of suffering. And yet, through the exhaustion, a different feeling simmered. A quiet, stubborn expectation that the storm in the capital must mean something. If power can move, they thought, maybe protection can move too. But the months that followed revealed a deeper truth. Changing leaders is easier than changing circumstances. Armed groups expanded into spaces left unguarded during the transition. Some villages found themselves forgotten in the bureaucratic reshuffling. Others became bargaining chips in negotiations they never heard about. The frontline did not wait, it advanced, and in its advance, the nation felt a second shock, not political, but territorial. Maps changed faster than announcements. Districts shrank, routes disappeared. Town after town reported a temporary evacuation that became anything but temporary. It was during this time that one name began appearing not in speeches, but in conversations whispered in markets, in camps, in barracks. Ibrahim Traoré, not as a savior, not as a symbol, but as a possibility, a representative of a generation that had known only instability and refused to inherit it quietly. To many, he embodied a question that the country had been too tired to ask. Could the younger leadership understand the younger war? The conflict facing Burkina Faso was not the conflict of decades past. It was fluid, fast, shifting across borders like dunes carried by wind. It required decisions unbound by the assumptions of earlier years. And in remote regions, people wondered whether the new leadership, younger, bolder, less tied to the old order, might finally break the cycle that had trapped them. But hope is fragile when held against reality. The days after the transition were harsher than expected. The country's resources were thin, its forces stretched, its administrative structures disrupted, and in many towns the absence of the state felt even more pronounced. Yet something subtle began to change. Small things at first. A convoy reaching a town that had been deemed unreachable, a school reopening after months of closure, a local committee reformed to track food distribution. None of these reversed the crisis, but they hinted at direction. Because the greatest danger was not that Burkina Faso would lose ground. It was that it would lose faith, faith in the map, faith in the center, faith in the idea that the state could return to the places it had left behind. And in 2022, that faith was as damaged as the roads leading north. Every kilometer lost felt like a fracture in the country's identity. Every village taken felt like a question mark over the nation's future. And those fractures would decide everything that followed. A nation was losing land, one silent kilometer at a time. Beyond its borders, Africa watched the storm with a familiar mixture of concern and recognition. Burkina Faso was not alone in its struggle, but it was now at the center of a continental question many had avoided for years. The African Union responded first, not with condemnation, but with caution. Statements urged stability, dialogue, a return to calm. Yet behind the formal language lay an unspoken awareness. The crisis in the Sahel was no longer a political anomaly. It was a regional pattern stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. ECOWAS, once confident in its ability to discipline its members, found itself less certain. The bloc's traditional mechanisms, sanctions, ultimatums, deadlines, no longer carried the weight they once did. Too many countries faced internal fractures. Too many citizens questioned whether the old frameworks understood the new wars that redefined the region. In private briefings, analysts admitted that the Sahel's instability was outgrowing ECOWAS's toolkit. The frontline was not political, it was geographic, spreading across deserts, borders, and abandoned highways. Further abroad, Europe watched with unease. Burkina Faso had become a measure of the Sahel's temperature, a signal of how quickly the region's shocks might reach its shores. Policies poured out of Brussels in the form of communiques, but even the most seasoned diplomats knew that statements could not reopen roads or reclaim territory. The United States approached the crisis through the lens of security. Counter-terror frameworks, regional cooperation, intelligence partnerships, all were recalibrated as Washington tried to keep pace with a landscape shifting faster than its reports could capture. Yet even American observers admitted a quiet truth. The center of gravity was moving away from familiar alliances. New partners emerged, not loudly, but steadily. Countries offering training, equipment, advisors, and political backing without the complex conditions that defined earlier eras. Some in the West described this as a geopolitical contest. Others saw it simply as the Sahel searching for alternatives. To the countries inside the crisis, it was neither competition nor ideology. It was survival. Mali and Niger, living through parallel storms, followed developments in Ouagadougou as if watching their own reflections. Each understood how fragile a state becomes when territory slips away faster than diplomacy can react. Each knew that whatever happened in Burkina would echo across their own borders. And in global institutions, from New York to Geneva, observers spoke carefully. Terms like transition, security vacuum, and regional spillover filled their documents. But none of these phrases captured the lived reality of a country fighting for coherence. Because no foreign capital, no matter how well briefed, could fully understand what it meant to defend a nation 1 lost kilometer at a time. The world could comment, but only Burkina could carry the consequence. And beyond every analysis, one truth remained. No observer standing far away could truly see the ground where the crisis was born. And the horizon darkened. In the months after the storm, Burkina Faso stood at a crossroads steeper than any mountain road in the north. The political page had turned, but the terrain remained broken, the map still scarred, the people still suspended between fear and expectation. From this fragile ground, 3 possible futures began to take shape. The first was a path of stabilization, not swift, not dramatic, but real. A future where the state slowly re-established its presence, one reopened route at a time, where convoys returned to towns once considered unreachable, where administrative posts revived in villages that had lived too long without an official seal or a state voice. This path required patience, and the belief that a fractured center could still gather its strength. The second was a path of prolonged tension. A future shaped by neither victory nor defeat. A war line that neither advanced nor retreated. Armored escorts still guarding every shipment. Roads that stayed open by day and closed again by dusk. A rhythm of uncertainty that left citizens living beside danger rather than beyond it. This future demanded endurance. And a population already exhausted might struggle to offer more. The third was the darkest path. A future where the pressure of 2022 did not break but multiplied, where districts slipped further away, where entire regions operated without connection to the capital, where humanitarian corridors became the only lifelines for communities once woven into the nation's fabric. A future shaped by fragmentation, the slow erosion of state presence until the map itself became a suggestion rather than a truth. Yet amid these possibilities, a different force began to rise. A younger generation, born into instability, but unwilling to inherit it. Volunteers joining defense units, students demanding representation, officers reshaping their doctrine to match a conflict that moved faster than older strategies could predict. They were not a solution, not yet, but they were a signal, a sign that the country was no longer waiting for change to be delivered from above. It was beginning to build from the ground up, and in this rising momentum, a new idea formed. A belief that a nation could reclaim its land in the same way it reclaimed its voice. The coming years would test this belief. The roads would remain dangerous, the decisions would remain heavy, and the stakes would remain higher than any political transition alone could resolve, because the storm of 2022 was not just an event, it was a threshold, and once a nation crosses such a threshold, it does not return to the place it stood before. In the shadow of that storm, a new generation was already stepping forward, and the next chapter waited. The storm of 2022 did not end when the convoys stopped moving or when the capital exhaled. It lingered, in the silence of abandoned roads, in the dust of emptied markets, in the shadows of towns that spent months waiting for help that could not reach them. But storms do more than destroy, they reveal. They strip away what is fragile and show what was always meant to endure. Across the Sahel and deep within Burkina Faso, this revelation took shape slowly, like a horizon clearing after long winds. A nation realized that its greatest vulnerability was not power changing hands, but land slipping away without resistance. And its greatest strength was not the armor it possessed, but the people who refused to disappear with the retreating map. In those people, a new chapter began. Farmers who chose to stay. Teachers who reopened classrooms even when the road outside remained unsafe. Young volunteers who carried nothing but determination and a borrowed uniform. Within this rising generation, the name Ibrahim Traoré echoed twice, not as a myth nor as a flawless figure, but as a reminder that leadership itself was changing. Younger, sharper, forged by crisis rather than comfort. And the question he carried, how does a nation reclaim itself, became a question the country learned to share. The answer was not immediate, not complete, but it was beginning. In the reclaimed corridors of the north, in the reopened schools of the east, in the renewed confidence that the storm had not broken the nation, only awakened it. Burkina Faso stepped into that storm with uncertainty. It emerged with a different kind of clarity, a clarity built on choice, not chance, on direction, not drift, on the understanding that nations are not defined by the crises they endure, but by the futures they insist on building after the dust settles. And so the question now turns outward, towards every viewer of this story. What does sovereignty mean when a nation decides its storm will not be its ending?